Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm your host, Dennis Ward. Our guest this week is Cora Morgan. She is the First Nations family and child advocate for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, a role she has been in for nearly 2 years now in a province with a record number of Indigenous children in care. Cora, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
For starters, Cora, Manitoba and other provinces have their own children's advocate. Why do you feel it was important to have a standalone First Nations advocate here in the province?
Well, how our advocate office came about was through engagement of communities. The Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs did engagement in the north and the south and came up with 10 recommendations, one being the need for an advocate. I think that it's really important that we have, and I should explain that our First Nations Family Advocate Office doesn't receive any funding from the federal or provincial government. We don't fall under legislation, and we are First Nations based, and we are answerable to our First Nation community. So I think that it's really important that we are doing this work from our perspective, and that we are doing it acknowledging the history of the theft of children for decades in our country, and we best understand the issues and the things that are happening to our families right now. And so I think that it's really important that we have our own people working with our own people, understanding our history and charting our way out of the mess that we're in.
Right from the beginning, your office was inundated with calls from families looking for help, upwards of 1,200 calls, I understand, a month. Has that caseload maintained, continues to be that high? It's
still that high. We still, on average, get 1,200 calls per month. I should note that our office has 2 staff, and so it's an enormous amount of need, and we can't possibly get to all of them, but you know, when you factor in how many children are in care, we know that there's a lot of parents that are looking for support in some way. And I think one of the things that was really important about the First Nations Family Advocate Office is that it was the first of its kind in Canada, and it was a mechanism that allowed for hope for our families and an extra voice to help support our families in having children returned.
Have you been, why do you think the office has been so busy? 1,200 calls a month, that is very busy.
Well, when we have over 11,000 children in care, and on a daily basis, you know, there's more children that are at risk of being apprehended every single day. At any moment of every day, there's CFS agencies that are watching our families and looking to apprehend children if they're determined in need of protection by their view. And you know, when we look at the newborn apprehension rates, we have 30 to 40 newborn babies being apprehended from one Winnipeg hospital a month. So, you know, there's a constant need for support.
You mentioned you're the first office like this in the country. Have you had calls from other provinces, other agencies looking to start up a similar type of office?
We have. We've had, I know that Saskatoon has, they put an advocate in place probably about 4 or 5 months ago in response to some of the concerns that they had in their province. We know that BC is making a move to have their own First Nations family advocate, and we know that a large area political body in Ontario is also looking to develop an advocacy office as well.
Manitoba has the highest number of kids in care in this country, around 11,000. You know, 90% of them are Indigenous. So what do you think is going on here in Manitoba that's leading to such high numbers of youth in care?
Well, I think there's a few different reasons. You know, we have the highest apprehension rates in the Western world. We have the lowest threshold for apprehension in all of North America. And then Manitoba has 76% of the children on reserve live below the poverty line. We have decades of theft of children through the residential schools and through the 60s scoop that kind of brought us today. We're fighting against those sorts of things. And then we're looking at, you know, the housing crisis and the, you know, all of the issues of underfunding on reserve that are leading to family breakdowns, and those are all the things that we're up against. And you know, some of those reasons are the things that precipitate children coming into the system.
The Truth and Reconciliation Commission found there are more Indigenous children being removed from their families today than attended residential school in any one year. Some have referred to the child welfare system as the new residential school system. Is that something that the way you would view it?
I would view it as that. I mean, it's the loss of identity, it's the theft of children. There's common denominators, but there's different things that are slightly different. Well, different, but the same. We've had decades of the residential school, then we moved to the 60 scoop, and this is more the contemporary view. And about a year or a few months into my role as the First Nations family advocate, I had a residential school survivor who approached me, and you know, there was, when people didn't fully understand the child welfare system, and not everyone understands it now, but they didn't like to compare the two. And now we're finding that survivors are making the comparison. And this one woman had said that what's happening now is worse than the residential school. And I thought that, I was curious, and I asked, why do you think that is? And she said, well, at least in residential school, children stayed home with their parents till they were 4 or 5 years old for those most fundamental years of life. And when we look at these newborn babies and toddlers that are being taken into the system, they're being deprived of those, you know, connections to their mother and their father, you know, from birth.
The fallout from the child welfare system in Manitoba is far-reaching. In the city of Winnipeg alone, 550 or more, roughly, cases of missing persons reported each month. The majority of those are kids that are in the welfare system. Also evidence that many young girls that are in the child welfare system end up in Winnipeg's sex trade. Have you seen this type of correlation in your work?
Well, I believe that today there's a new stat coming out about missing persons, and I know for 2015 there was 8,859 missing persons in Manitoba, and 85% of them were children in care, 70% of them being female. So we see that. We see that children are running away from group home environments, foster placements, and a lot of times children are just trying to go home. And you know, you find that the longer children are in care, they lose value for life. At the end of the day, as soon as a child is apprehended, they're instantly grieving. They lose everything they know in their life. And you know, as adults, some people who have relationship breakdowns, it's hard. But when you think about children, the minute that they're apprehended, they lose everything they know, and that grief is never addressed. And so a lot of times what happens is when they're in the system, they're trying to go home, or they're trying to search for some sort of belonging or family or connection.
The numbers we're just mentioning are staggering. Is this something that you've seen or hear about in other provinces, or is this a Manitoba problem?
Well, I mean, it's an issue across the country. As soon as you take children, there's going to be issues. Because Manitoba has such high statistics, the numbers, I think, are just heightened here.
Manitoba has about 1/6 of all children in care in this country?
Well, I've never done that calculation, but I know, you know, our provincial population is 1.1 million. And I know when you compare it to, say, Alberta, who has about 4.5 million, we still have 4 times the number of newborn apprehensions. So we know that our numbers are dramatically higher. And I think second to us is Saskatchewan for child apprehension rates, but I think their numbers are still dramatically lower than Manitoba.
We're speaking with Cora Morgan, Manitoba's First Nations family and child advocate. We'll have more with Cora on Face to Face after this quick break. Stay with us. Welcome back. Our guest today on Face to Face is Cora Morgan, the First Nations family and child advocate for the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs. Cora, you have a background working in the area of restorative justice, and you've spoken about the connection between the child welfare system and the justice system. We've seen numbers, 88% of those incarcerated in Manitoba's federal penitentiary are former children in care. Are these the types of connections that you've seen between the two?
Oh, absolutely. I worked 8 years in restorative justice, and seeing one of the trends that I started to see about five years ago was that we had an enormous amount of children and adults who were in the child welfare system. So one of the things that we started to do was to track the numbers, and we found, that about 85% of our client base were children and adults that had connections to child welfare. There was that stat that 88% of the inmates in Stony Mountain were former children in care, and we started doing GLADU reports where we were going into jails and prisons and for individuals who were awaiting sentencing and writing their GLADU reports, and in all of that we saw that there is a direct link. When we were doing the GLADU reports, it was almost as about 98% of those awaiting sentencing were former children in care. 100% of them had a direct link to the residential school system within their family. So we saw that it was a feed, and in those years we were also seeing that an enormous amount of children were going into the Manitoba Youth Centre. And when we would meet with young youth under the age of 18 that were in and out of the youth center, we saw that their value for life was so low that it didn't matter whether they were in their CFS group home, foster home, or in the youth center. So it painted a kind of bleak reality for our young people then when they lose value for life, and that they feel like no one cares about them and that they're just being bounced around in the system. And we see that our young people are being institutionalized from birth till death. And it's just all these different systems that are feeding our young people and feeding off our young people, because it is an industry.
We've heard stories of youth who would rather be in youth detention center rather than group homes. Was that something that you encountered?
Absolutely. And Manitoba ended the practice, apparently ended the practice of hotel room stays after Tina Fontaine, and in June 1st, 2015, there was to be no more hotel stays. We knew that young people in that area of those hotel room stays preferred the youth center. We know that a lot of the group homes, and last year there was a child that was moved 217 times in 1 year. And so when you're looking at some of the things that are happening to these young people, a lot of times they feel safer in the Manitoba Youth Center. And, it's a sad reality when, their best case scenario is being in the youth center or under detention.
Is it your understanding that no more youth are in hotels? I mean, that's what we've been told, that the government has ended that practice. Have you heard of any cases where it has happened since?
Well, I haven't per se have heard that. I know that hotels are used a lot for visits for parents and children. And so many times, children are in the hotel rooms to visit their parents. So they're still being utilized.
We've covered the myriad of problems that arise from being a child in care. Let's talk about some of the solutions. Is there any one thing that you think could be enacted today that could turn this system that is in crisis around?
Well, I think our communities need an enormous amount of healing and prevention. Interestingly, we had a forum and we had a panel of young people, and when they asked about their experience, they had aged out of CFS, and when we asked about their experience in child welfare, they had said that they wished that their foster homes were vetted and that they weren't moved around so much, and they wanted, better places to stay while they were in care. And I thought it was really interesting because not one of them suggested that they go home. And to me it seemed as though no one believes that children can go home. And, it's a sad reality that, we've been, after all of these years of the theft of children, it's almost a practice that we come to expect that our children are taken. And I think that what we need to do is really focus on prevention and making our families healthy and keeping them out of this system. we have the power to do that. In the work that I do at the First Nations Family Advocate Office, we're not to empower the system in any way. We are to concentrate on how our families lived years ago and those traditional practices that led to healthy family life. There was a study done, and the optimal environment to raise children was those of hunter and gatherers, and so we have that history of taking good care of our children, and our children need to be returned to the center, because that's what we believe, that the children are at the forefront of decision making, and everything should be provided to our children. And that the minute a child is born, it's our responsibility to ensure that that child has the tools that they need to be the best, and that they can hone their gifts and talents. And we need to go back to those times, and we need to go back to those belief systems, and making sure that our children are healthy and that our families are healthy.
You had accused the previous government of Manitoba, the NDP government, of trying to muzzle you and your office, and found an ally in the opposition Progressive Conservatives at the time. Now they're in power. Have you seen many changes in the system since they've taken over? I
haven't seen any changes. I haven't seen any glimpse or glimmer of anything meaningful happening. I had big hopes because they had made some really strong commitments to the First Nations Family Advocate Office. However, it hasn't amounted to anything for us. I haven't seen any meaningful connection to the Assembly Manitoba Chiefs or the First Nations Family Advocate that they were going to do anything different. And so, I'm very disappointed, to say the least. Over these last 16 years of the NDP government, the number of children in care has skyrocketed. It started at around 2,000, and now we're at over 11,000. And, the Conservative government, or the opposition, had 16 years to witness the fallout of some of the things that have happened in the system. And, they had plans. When they were campaigning, they had plans of wonderful things that were going to happen for First Nations engagement and meaningful ways to address the issue of the overrepresentation of Indigenous children in the system. But to date, I haven't seen anything meaningful or had any meaningful extensions made to our office.
You mentioned the skyrocketing of numbers that doubled almost over a 10-year period there. So they've been holding steady around the 11,000 children in care. How long do you think it will take before we actually see some of those numbers come down in a significant way?
Well, there's a lot of damage that is done. We're holding steady around 11,000, but that means children are aging out of the system. And, Salome Mission, which is one of the #1 places for homeless people in Winnipeg, 49% of their client base are children who age out of the system. We know that children are going into prisons and jails as soon as they age out of the system, and it's a bleak future. So I think what has given me hope is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, and the successful win of the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal by the First Nations Caring Society. Those were, significant things that have happened since our office has opened. And right now, the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs is engaging our First Nations in Manitoba on how we're going to change the system. And so that means right now we're going to be going into 20 First Nations in Manitoba, and we're going to be meeting with people and all the different service providers on reserve and different areas of expertise. And we're going to engage with parents and grandparents and children to see how we could build a system that would meet our needs, and that is motivated by our own communities and our own First Nations ways of doing things.
So much more we could talk about, Cora, especially aging out and stuff. But, I've done dozens of stories on CFS, many of them with you. They're heavy stories, traumatic stories to do. I'm wondering what the impact on you personally has been in this 2 years in this role.
Well, it's been really hard. I know that my quality of life is deteriorated. It's hard. At any moment, on any day, you know that there's children that are suffering because they're grieving and they're lost. We know that our sovereignty is in our children, and when we have so many of our children that are being taken into these systems, it's dismal. And pretty much every single day, I speak to or meet with at least one mother who's desperate, or one grandmother or one father who's desperate to have their children returned. And you hear so many stories of suffering all day, every day. And, it's really tough. And even for me, particularly holidays, at Christmas time, at Thanksgiving, I can't help but visualize these children that are in these shelters and group homes, and they're without their family. So, and just all the stories are different, and when think you've heard enough, there's always more.
Cora, obviously a difficult job. Thank you for the work you do. Thank you for joining us on Face to Face today. I wish we had more time, but we'll be back with to wrap up this week's episode coming up. Welcome back to Face to Face. Next week on the show, our guest will be Lester House. He was involved in the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s and is known for his knowledge in international law. Most recently, he's been asked to help a group who had border problems returning from the protests in Standing Rock. Here's a look at some of our conversation.
And the treaties I speak of are before Columbus. There are 6 treaties that are the foundation of international law that every nation must abide by. I came onto these treaties through the late Meredith Quinn, who's registered at the United Nations as a Dakota signatory Indian. And he's the one that arrested 2 Supreme Court justices by using the law. Now, the reason they submitted immediately and stepped off the bench is so that they wouldn't be responsible for the collapse of their corpus juris secundum, the collapse of their rule of law. Because their rule of law is second law of the land, corpus juris secundum. The late Meredith went by, as I do know, first law of the land, supersedes.
What are judges' reactions, Lester, when they see you walk into the courtroom?
Well, I'll say this. They always usually ask ahead of time, who's your legal representative? So a lot of the people that call me. And when they find out, there's usually a shuffle, because I've been through 4 judges who finally, all of them, 4 of them, stepped down. They didn't want to handle it, so they ended up back with the original judge. So I'm well known among the judiciary, and I'm not very well liked, but I feel good about that.
That's all for today. We're always looking for new guests, so if you have any suggestions, please email us at news@aptn.ca. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward.